Hello everyone. Tonight we are traveling back into the medieval world, a time when religion, power and conquest were deeply intertwined. For centuries, historians have focused on the famous Crusades to the Holy Land. Vast armies marched toward Jerusalem. Knights fought beneath the symbol of the cross. And for generations, Christian and Muslim civilizations struggled for control of sacred ground. But far from the deserts of the Middle East, another series of crusades was unfolding. In the forests and frozen rivers of northern Europe, crusading armies fought a very different kind of holy war. Here, the enemy was not Muslim empires. Instead, it was Europe's last surviving pagan civilizations. These conflicts would last for more than 200 years. They would reshape the political map of northern Europe. Entire cultures would disappear. Kingdoms would rise. And one of the most powerful military orders in medieval history would carve out its own state. This was the story of the Northern Crusades. But to understand how these wars began, we must first travel back to the moment when the idea of crusading itself was born. At the end of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire stood in a dangerous position. For nearly 1,000 years, this empire had been the continuation of the Roman state in the east. Its capital, Constantinople, was the greatest city in Europe, a center of trade, culture, and political power. The Byzantine emperors saw themselves as the heirs of the Roman Caesars. Their armies defended the borders of Christian civilization against enemies from every direction. But by the late 1100s, the empire was beginning to crumble. In the year 1071, a disaster struck that would change the fate of the Eastern Mediterranean. At the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine army faced the rising power of the Seljuk Turks. These Turkish warriors had recently entered the Middle East, bringing new military tactics and an aggressive spirit of expansion. The Byzantine army was defeated. The consequences were devastating. Within a few decades, most of Asia Minor, the empire's economic and military heartland, fell under Turkish control. Cities that had been Greek and Christian for centuries suddenly found themselves ruled by Muslim governors. Trade routes collapsed. Agricultural lands were lost. Waves of refugees fled westward into the remaining Byzantine territories. The once powerful empire was now struggling simply to survive. When Alexios I Komnenos seized the Byzantine throne in 1081, he inherited a state surrounded by enemies. To the west, Norman warriors threatened the Balkans. To the north, steppe raiders attacked the frontier. And to the east, the Seljuk Turks controlled much of the empire's former homeland. Alexios understood something many earlier emperors had refused to accept. The Byzantine Empire could no longer defend itself alone. So the emperor turned toward an unlikely source of help: Western Europe. Relations between Byzantium and Western Europe had long been complicated. Both sides were Christian, but they followed different traditions. The Byzantine world practiced Orthodox Christianity centered around Constantinople. Western Europe followed the authority of the Catholic Church in Rome. Only a few decades earlier, the two churches had formally split during the Great Schism of 1054. Despite this division, Alexios hoped that shared faith might still unite them against a common enemy. In the year 1095, Byzantine envoys arrived in Western Europe carrying an urgent request. They asked the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban II, for military assistance. The emperor did not ask for massive armies or religious crusades. He simply wanted trained knights who could serve as mercenaries against the Turks. But the Pope saw a much larger opportunity. During this period, the papacy was gaining new influence across Europe. Popes were reforming the church, challenging kings, and trying to unite Christian rulers under their leadership. Urban II believed the Byzantine appeal could help achieve several goals at once. It might save the Byzantine Empire. It might heal the growing division between Eastern and Western Christianity. And it might strengthen the authority of the papacy itself. In November of 1095, the Pope called a council in the French town of Clermont. Nobles, bishops, and knights gathered to hear him speak. What Urban said that day would ignite one of the most powerful movements of the medieval age. He spoke about the suffering of Christians in the East. He described sacred sites in Jerusalem that were believed to be threatened under Muslim rule. Then he issued a dramatic call. Western Christians should take up arms and march eastward to liberate the Holy Land. This would not be an ordinary war. It would be a holy war. Those who joined the expedition would receive an extraordinary spiritual reward, the forgiveness of their sins. In a deeply religious society where fear of eternal punishment shaped everyday life, this promise carried enormous power. According to medieval chroniclers, the crowd responded with a cry that echoed across the gathering. Deus vult. God wills it. Within months, thousands of people across Europe began preparing for the journey east. Some were knights seeking glory and adventure. Others were peasants driven by religious devotion. Entire families sold their possessions and set out toward lands they had never seen. The journey was long and brutal. Many crusaders died before they ever reached the Middle East. But after years of campaigning, the crusading armies achieved an astonishing victory. In 1099, they captured the city of Jerusalem. The conquest was bloody. Medieval chroniclers described massacres inside the city walls. Yet for many Christians in Europe, the victory seemed like proof that God supported the crusading movement. Several new Crusader states were established in the Eastern Mediterranean. For a moment, it appeared that a new Christian frontier had been created in the Middle East. But the success of the First Crusade produced an unexpected consequence. It created a powerful new idea. The idea that war itself could be sanctified, that fighting for the church could bring salvation. And once this idea existed, it could be applied almost anywhere. Over time, the concept of crusading spread far beyond its original purpose. Popes began declaring crusades not only against Muslim powers in the Middle East, but also against enemies within Europe itself. Crusades were launched against religious heretics. They were used against political rivals of the papacy. And eventually, they were directed toward people who were not Christian at all. By the 12th century, most of Europe had already converted to Christianity. But one region remained very different. Along the shores of the Baltic Sea, ancient pagan traditions still thrived. To the leaders of medieval Christendom, these lands represented both a danger and an opportunity. They were the last pagan frontier in Europe. Across the northern horizon stretched a vast landscape surrounding the Baltic Sea. This region was home to many different peoples, including the Prussians, Lithuanians, Livonians, Estonians, Finnic tribes, and the West Slavic Wends. Unlike the centralized kingdoms of Western Europe, these societies were organized into tribal communities. Their religions were deeply connected to nature. Sacred groves served as temples. Ancient trees were believed to house powerful spirits. Fires burned at holy sites, where priests guarded rituals passed down through generations. Among the Prussians, religious leaders known as Krai oversaw ceremonies and interpreted the will of the gods. The Lithuanians worshipped deities connected to thunder, forests, rivers, and the changing seasons. These beliefs had existed for centuries, but to Christian missionaries, they represented dangerous pagan superstition. Church leaders believed it was their duty to convert these societies to Christianity, peacefully if possible, but by force if necessary. One reason these traditions survived so long was geography. The Baltic lands were dominated by dense forests, marshlands, and harsh winters. Large kingdoms were difficult to build in such terrain. Villages were scattered across great distances. Invading armies often struggled to move through unfamiliar landscapes. These conditions favoured the local tribes, who knew the terrain well and used ambushes and raids to defend their territory. For centuries, this environment helped protect the Baltic world from conquest. Yet the region was far from isolated. The Baltic Sea served as an important trade network linking Scandinavia, Germany, and the eastern lands of Russia. Merchants carried goods such as furs, timber, wax, and amber across these waters. Amber, sometimes called Baltic gold, had been prized across Europe since ancient times. Controlling these trade routes meant wealth and influence. For rulers in Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, the pagan lands along the Baltic coast represented both a religious mission and an economic opportunity. Soon, the idea of crusading would reach this frontier. In the year 1147, the Catholic Church officially authorized a crusade against the pagan Slavs living along the Baltic frontier. German princes and Danish rulers gathered armies to push eastward into pagan territories. Their enemy was the Wendish tribes, who had resisted Christian expansion for generations. One of their most determined leaders was the Prince Niklot. Niklot relied on defensive tactics and knowledge of the terrain to resist the invading crusaders. Despite months of fighting, the crusaders achieved only limited success. Some local leaders agreed to accept baptism, but many of these conversions were temporary. Even so, the campaign established an important precedent. From this point forward, wars against pagan peoples in the Baltic region could officially be recognized as crusades. This decision would lead to centuries of conflict. In the decades that followed, the Kingdom of Denmark began expanding its influence across the Baltic Sea. One of the most important targets of Danish expansion was the island of Rügen. At the center of the island stood the fortress of Arkona, home to the temple of the pagan god Svantevit. In 1168, the Danish king Valdemar I launched an expedition against the island. The fortress fell after a short siege. The temple was destroyed and the statue of Svantevit was burned. The fall of Arkona marked one of the most symbolic moments of the early Northern Crusades. Yet the Baltic world remained far from conquered. Across the sea, the Kingdom of Sweden was also expanding eastward. Swedish rulers launched campaigns into Finland, where Finnic tribes practiced their own ancient religions. Over time, Swedish authority spread through the region. Fortresses were built. Churches were established. Finland gradually became integrated into the Swedish kingdom. But the most powerful force of the Northern Crusades was still to come. Across Europe, a new kind of institution had begun to emerge. These were the military orders. They were religious brotherhoods of warrior monks who combined spiritual devotion with military discipline. Among these orders, one would soon dominate the Baltic frontier: the Teutonic Knights. Originally founded during the Crusades in the Holy Land, the Teutonic Order was composed mainly of German knights. Members wore white cloaks marked with a black cross. They lived according to strict religious rules, yet they were also highly trained soldiers. In time, the Teutonic Knights would shift their focus from the Middle East to the Baltic region. There, they would transform the Northern Crusades into one of the longest and most brutal campaigns in European history. But before the Teutonic Order rose to dominance, another military order had already begun fighting in the Baltic: the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Founded in 1202 by the German bishop Albert of Riga, this order was created to conquer and convert the pagan peoples of Livonia. The city of Riga soon became the center of Crusader activity in the region. German settlers arrived in growing numbers. Fortified castles were built across the countryside. The conquered territories were organized into a political structure known as Terra Mariana, the Land of Mary. But the expansion of Crusader power did not go unchallenged. Among the fiercest opponents of the Crusaders were the Samogitians, a Baltic people connected to the rising power of Lithuania. In the year 1236, these warriors would defeat the Livonian Brothers of the Sword in a devastating battle. The order would collapse, and in its place, the Teutonic Knights would step forward to lead the crusading movement in the Baltic. From that moment onward, the Northern Crusades would enter a far more organized and relentless phase. The forests and rivers of the Baltic world were about to become the battleground for one of the longest holy wars in European history. The defeat of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword marked a turning point in the Northern Crusades. For decades, the crusading movement in the Baltic had been scattered and unstable. Different rulers launched their own campaigns, and military orders struggled to maintain control over newly conquered territories. But after the destruction of the Sword Brothers, a far more powerful force stepped into the conflict: the Teutonic Knights. Founded during the Crusades in the Middle East, the Teutonic Order had already gained a reputation for discipline and organization. Its members followed strict religious vows, but they were also highly trained soldiers. When the surviving members of the Sword Brothers were absorbed into the Teutonic Order in 1237, the balance of power in the Baltic changed dramatically. From that moment onward, the crusading movement in the region would be led by a single, highly structured military order: the Teutonic Knights. Their goal was simple: conquer the remaining pagan territories of the Baltic world and bring them permanently under Christian rule. But this task would not be easy. Across the region, powerful tribal societies still resisted Crusader expansion. Among them were the Prussians, a group of Baltic peoples who lived along the southeastern coast of the Baltic Sea. For generations, the Prussians had defended their independence against outside forces. Their villages were protected by fortified hill settlements. Their warriors were skilled in ambush and irregular warfare, and their spiritual traditions were deeply rooted in the forests and sacred sites of their homeland. To the Crusaders, these lands represented the next great frontier of Christian expansion. But before the Teutonic Knights could begin their conquest, they needed a base of operations. An invitation soon provided the opportunity they needed. In the early 13th century, The Polish ruler, Duke Konrad of Masovia, faced a serious problem. His lands bordered the territory of the Prussians, and raids from pagan tribes had become increasingly destructive. Konrad had attempted to subdue them himself, but his forces struggled to maintain control over the region, so he turned to the Teutonic Knights. In 1226, Konrad invited the order to settle along his frontier and help defend his territory against the Prussians. The agreement seemed simple. The Teutonic Knights would help protect the border and convert the local pagan population. But the order had far greater ambitions. With the support of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, the Teutonic Knights secured legal authority to rule any lands they conquered in Prussia. This meant that their new territory would not belong to Poland. It would belong to the order itself. The Teutonic Knights were about to create their own state. Soon after arriving in the region, the order began constructing a network of fortified castles. These fortresses served several purposes. They protected Crusader armies. They controlled trade routes and river crossings. And they provided secure bases from which the knights could launch further campaigns. One of the earliest of these strongholds was built along the Vistula River. From there, the Teutonic Knights gradually pushed deeper into Prussian territory. The conquest was slow and brutal. Crusader armies burned villages, destroyed sacred sites, and forced captured populations to accept baptism. But the Prussians did not surrender easily. Again and again, they rose in rebellion against the invading Crusaders. Entire regions erupted in revolt. Warriors launched surprise attacks against Crusader fortresses and supply routes. For decades, the conflict continued in cycles of conquest and rebellion. But the Teutonic Knights possessed advantages their enemies did not. They were well organized. They received reinforcements from across Europe, and they were able to build permanent strongholds that allowed them to hold conquered territory. Gradually, the balance of power began to shift. New settlers arrived from the German lands to colonize the conquered regions. Cities were founded, trade routes expanded, Christian churches replaced pagan temples. The Teutonic state began to take shape along the Baltic frontier. Yet, even as the knights expanded their power, a new threat was emerging in the east. Beyond the forests and rivers of Prussia lay a rising kingdom that remained fiercely pagan, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Unlike the scattered tribes the Crusaders had fought before, Lithuania was becoming a powerful and organized state. Its rulers commanded large armies. Its warriors were experienced in fighting both Crusaders and neighboring powers. And unlike many other Baltic peoples, the Lithuanians were beginning to unite under a single political leadership. For the Teutonic Knights, this presented a serious challenge. Lithuania was now the largest remaining pagan power in Europe. Converting it would be the ultimate victory of the Northern Crusades. But defeating it would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. The struggle between the Teutonic Order and Lithuania would last for generations, and it would produce some of the most dramatic battles in medieval European history. The Northern Crusades were entering their most violent and decisive phase. The wars for the Baltic were only just beginning. As the Teutonic Knights expanded their control across Prussia, their crusading state began to grow stronger with each passing decade. What had begun as a defensive mission along the Polish frontier was slowly transforming into something much larger. The order was building a new kind of political power. A state ruled not by kings, but by warrior monks. At the center of this state stood the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, the supreme leader of the Knights. Under him served commanders known as landmeisters and regional officers who governed newly conquered territories. Every castle, every settlement, and every military campaign followed the strict discipline of the order. This structure made the Teutonic Knights one of the most organized military forces in medieval Europe. But organization alone did not guarantee victory. The conquest of Prussia would take decades of brutal warfare. The Prussian tribes were not united under a single ruler. Instead, they were divided into several groups, including the Sambians, Warmians, Pogossanians, and Natangians. Each tribe defended its own territory, and each had its own leaders and warriors. At first, this lack of unity helped the Crusaders. The Teutonic Knights could defeat tribes one at a time, building new fortresses after each victory. But as the Crusaders pushed deeper into the region, resistance began to grow. The Prussians quickly realized that the arrival of the Teutonic Order threatened their entire way of life. Sacred forests were destroyed. Pagan shrines were burned. Communities that refused baptism were often forced into submission. For many Prussian warriors, the struggle against the Crusaders became a fight for survival. By the middle of the 13th century, the tension finally erupted into open rebellion. In 1242, several Prussian tribes rose up against the Teutonic Knights. This conflict became known as the First Prussian Uprising. Prussian warriors attacked Crusader settlements and isolated castles. Some fortresses were destroyed. In other areas, the local population expelled Christian authorities. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Teutonic state might collapse. But the order responded with determination. Reinforcements arrived from across the Holy Roman Empire. Knights from Germany and other parts of Europe joined the crusade. Gradually, the rebellion was suppressed. Yet the conflict had revealed an important truth. The Prussians were capable of organizing a large-scale resistance. And only a few years later, an even greater revolt would begin. In 1260, news arrived from the north that changed everything. At the Battle of Durba, the Teutonic Knights and their Livonian allies suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Samogitians and their Baltic allies. The loss shocked the Crusader world. Across Prussia, the news sparked a massive uprising. Tribe after tribe joined the rebellion. This conflict became known as the Great Prussian Uprising. For more than a decade, the Prussian tribes fought desperately to reclaim their homeland. Several Crusader castles were destroyed. Entire regions slipped out of Teutonic control. In some places, the knights were forced to retreat behind the walls of their strongest fortresses. But once again, the order called for help. Crusaders from across Europe answered the call. German princes, knights, and soldiers arrived to reinforce the Teutonic armies. With renewed strength, the order slowly began to regain control. Castle by castle, region by region, the rebellion was crushed. By 1274, the Great Prussian Uprising had finally been defeated. The consequences were profound. The independent Prussian tribes had been broken. Large numbers of the population were killed, displaced, or absorbed into the expanding Crusader society. German settlers moved into the region in increasing numbers. Over time, the original Prussian language and culture would gradually disappear. In their place, a new society emerged, one shaped by German settlers, Christian institutions, and the authority of the Teutonic Order. The Crusader state in Prussia had survived its greatest challenge, and now it was stronger than ever. massive brick castles rose across the countryside, connected by roads and fortified towns. Among the most impressive of these strongholds was Marienburg Castle, which would eventually become the capital of the Teutonic Order's state. With its enormous walls and towers, Marienburg symbolized the power of the Crusader Knights. From these fortresses, the Order governed its growing territory like a disciplined military machine. Trade flourished under the protection of the Order's armies. Ports along the Baltic Sea became important centers of commerce. The Teutonic state was no longer just a frontier outpost. It had become one of the most powerful political forces in the region. Yet beyond its borders, one enemy remained unconquered. To the east, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania continued to expand. Unlike the Prussian tribes, Lithuania had developed into a strong and organized state. Its rulers commanded large armies and controlled vast territories stretching deep into Eastern Europe. Most importantly, Lithuania remained proudly pagan. For the Teutonic Knights, this made Lithuania the ultimate target of their crusading mission. As long as Lithuania remained independent and unconverted, the Northern Crusades could not truly be considered complete. And so, the Knights turned their attention eastward. What followed would be a long and relentless struggle. For more than a century, the Teutonic Order and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania would wage war across forests, rivers, and frozen battlefields. This conflict would shape the future of the entire Baltic world, and it would eventually lead to one of the largest and most famous battles of medieval Europe. But before that decisive clash could occur, the struggle between Crusaders and pagans would intensify in ways few could have imagined. The Northern Crusades were entering their most dramatic chapter. As the Teutonic Order strengthened its control over Prussia, the focus of the Northern Crusades gradually shifted eastward. Beyond the frontier of the Crusader state lay the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the last major pagan power in Europe. Unlike the scattered tribes the Crusaders had previously fought, Lithuania had grown into a large and organized political entity. Its rulers controlled vast territories stretching across forests, rivers, and plains that extended deep into Eastern Europe. Lithuanian warriors had already proven themselves formidable opponents. They were skilled horsemen, capable of launching fast raids across long distances. Their armies moved quickly through forests and marshlands, where heavily armored Crusader knights often struggled to maneuver. But perhaps the greatest strength of Lithuania was its political unity. While many other Baltic tribes had remained divided, Lithuanian leaders gradually succeeded in bringing different clans and territories under a single authority. This emerging state would become the greatest obstacle to the crusading movement in the north. During the early 13th century, the Lithuanian ruler Mindaugas began consolidating power across the region. Through diplomacy, alliances, and warfare, he expanded Lithuanian influence over neighboring territories. In 1253, Mindaugas even accepted baptism and was crowned King of Lithuania with the support of the Catholic Church. For a brief moment, it appeared that Lithuania might peacefully join the Christian world, but the arrangement proved fragile. Political tensions, internal conflicts, and continued pressure from Crusader forces soon undermined the fragile alliance. Within a few years, Mindaugas abandoned Christianity, and Lithuania returned to its traditional pagan faith. The Crusaders now saw Lithuania not only as a powerful enemy, but as a kingdom that had rejected conversion. The wars between the Teutonic Knights and Lithuania intensified. Year after year, Crusader armies launched raids into Lithuanian territory. These expeditions, often called Rysen, became a regular part of life along the Baltic frontier. Knights from across Europe travelled to Prussia to participate in these campaigns. For many young nobles, the Rysen offered an opportunity for adventure and prestige. Fighting against pagan enemies was considered both a religious duty and a test of knightly honour. But these campaigns rarely produced decisive victories. The Lithuanian armies avoided large confrontations whenever possible. Instead, they relied on mobility and surprise. They struck quickly against isolated Crusader forces, then retreated into forests and swamps where pursuit became difficult. Villages were burned. Fortifications were attacked. Border regions became zones of constant violence. For decades, the war continued in this brutal rhythm of raids and counter-raids. Meanwhile, the Lithuanian state continued to grow stronger. Under rulers such as Gediminas and later Algirdas, the Grand Duchy expanded far beyond its original Baltic homeland. Lithuanian armies pushed south and east, conquering large territories that had once belonged to declining Russ's principalities. By the 14th century, Lithuania controlled lands that stretched from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea. It had become one of the largest states in Europe. And yet, despite its size and power, Lithuania remained officially pagan. This fact deeply troubled the leaders of the Catholic Church. For more than a century, crusading armies had fought to convert the Baltic region. Most of the smaller pagan societies had already been conquered, but Lithuania remained independent. As long as the Lithuanian rulers refused baptism, the Teutonic Order could continue to justify its campaigns as part of a holy crusade. The war between the two powers therefore became both political and religious. But the situation was about to change. To the south of the Teutonic state lay another powerful kingdom, the Kingdom of Poland. For years, Poland had watched the growing strength of the Teutonic Order with increasing concern. Originally, the Order had been invited to help defend the frontier. Now it controlled a powerful and heavily fortified state along the Baltic coast. Relations between Poland and the Teutonic Knights became increasingly tense. At the same time, the rulers of Lithuania began searching for allies who could help them resist the Crusaders. This search would eventually lead to one of the most important political alliances in medieval European history. In 1386, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila made a decision that would transform the balance of power in the Baltic region. Jogaila agreed to marry the Polish queen Jadwiga. As part of the agreement, he accepted baptism into the Catholic faith. Soon afterward, he was crowned King of Poland, taking the name Władysław II Jagiełło. Lithuania officially converted to Christianity. For centuries, Crusaders had justified their wars by claiming they were fighting to convert pagans. Now, the largest pagan kingdom in Europe had voluntarily accepted Christianity. The consequences were enormous. The Teutonic Order suddenly lost its main religious justification for attacking Lithuania. But the rivalry between the two powers did not end. Instead, the conflict evolved into a struggle for political dominance in Eastern Europe. On one side stood the powerful Crusader state of the Teutonic Knights. On the other stood a new alliance, the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania. The stage was now set for one of the greatest confrontations of the medieval age. Within a generation, these rival powers would clash in a battle so large that chroniclers across Europe would record its outcome. The fate of the Teutonic Order and the future of the Baltic region would be decided on the battlefield. And the place where that decision would be made was called Grunwald. King Władysław II Jagiełło, the two states had effectively become allies. Together, they controlled vast territories stretching from the Baltic Sea deep into Eastern Europe. For the Teutonic Order, this new alliance was deeply troubling. The Crusader state had grown powerful through decades of expansion. Its castles, armies, and trade networks made it one of the strongest military powers in the Baltic region. But the union of Poland and Lithuania now created a rival power of equal strength. Relations between the two sides quickly began to deteriorate. The Teutonic Knights questioned the sincerity of Lithuania's conversion to Christianity. Many within the order argued that Lithuanian rulers had accepted baptism only for political reasons. From the perspective of the Crusaders, Lithuania remained an unreliable and potentially dangerous neighbour. Meanwhile, the Polish and Lithuanian rulers viewed the Teutonic Order with increasing suspicion. The Crusader state controlled large areas of territory along the Baltic coast that Poland believed rightfully belonged to it. These disputes created a growing sense of tension. Throughout the late 14th century, negotiations and diplomatic efforts failed to resolve these conflicts. Both sides continued to prepare for war. In 1409, the situation finally exploded into open conflict. A rebellion broke out in Samogitia, a region that had long been contested between Lithuania and the Teutonic Order. The uprising was supported by Lithuanian forces, and the Teutonic Knights responded with military action. Soon, Poland entered the war as Lithuania's ally. The conflict that followed became known as the Great War between the Polish-Lithuanian alliance and the Teutonic Order. Both sides began gathering their armies for what would become one of the largest military confrontations in medieval Europe. The Teutonic Knights mobilized their forces from across their territories. Experienced knights arrived from the German lands, many eager to defend the reputation of the order. Meanwhile, the Polish and Lithuanian alliance assembled a diverse army made up of warriors from many different regions. Polish knights formed the core of the heavy cavalry. Lithuanian forces brought experienced light cavalry skilled in rapid maneuvering. Allied contingents also arrived from other parts of Eastern Europe. As the summer of 1410 approached, both sides prepared for a decisive confrontation. The two armies eventually met in the rolling countryside of what is now northern Poland. The battlefield lay between the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Łodwigowo. On the morning of July 15th, 1410, thousands of soldiers gathered beneath their banners. Chroniclers later recorded many different estimates for the size of the armies. Some believed that more than 40,000 soldiers took part in the battle. Whatever the exact numbers, it was clear that this would be one of the largest battles fought in medieval Europe. The Teutonic army was commanded by the Grand Master of the Order, Ulrich von Jungingen. A seasoned leader and experienced warrior, Jungingen believed that a decisive victory could break the growing power of Poland and Lithuania. Opposing him stood King Władysław II Jagiełło and his cousin, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Vytautas. Together, they commanded the combined armies of their alliance. The tension on the battlefield was immense. For the Teutonic Knights, this battle represented the defense of their Crusader state and their reputation as the defenders of Christianity in the Baltic. For Poland and Lithuania, It was a struggle to break the power of a rival that had dominated the region for generations. As the armies prepared for battle, the summer sun rose over the fields. Banners fluttered in the warm air. Thousands of soldiers waited for the signal to advance. Soon, one of the most famous battles of medieval history would begin. The outcome would change the balance of power in Eastern Europe forever. The Battle of Grunwald was about to begin. The morning of July 15th, 1410, dawned warm and still across the fields near the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg. Two great armies faced each other across the open countryside. On one side stood the forces of the Teutonic Order. Their ranks were filled with heavily armoured knights, disciplined infantry, and experienced soldiers from across the German lands. White banners marked with the black cross of the Order fluttered above the assembled troops. Opposite them stood the combined armies of Poland and Lithuania. Their forces were more diverse. Polish knights in shining armour formed powerful cavalry units, while Lithuanian warriors brought fast and flexible light cavalry. Additional allies from Eastern Europe joined their ranks, creating a large and varied army. At the centre of the Teutonic army stood Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen. For him, this battle was more than a military confrontation. It was a test of the Order's honour and strength. For decades, the Teutonic Knights had dominated the Baltic region. Their reputation as disciplined crusaders had made them feared across Europe. But now that reputation was about to be challenged. According to several medieval accounts, the Teutonic Knights attempted to provoke the opposing army into attacking first. Messengers from the Order rode forward carrying two swords. They presented these swords to King Władysław Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas. The gesture was intended as an insult, a challenge suggesting that the Polish and Lithuanian leaders needed weapons and courage to face the Crusaders. Instead of rushing into battle, the Allied commanders remained patient. Their forces held position. For hours, the armies waited beneath the summer sun. Finally, in the early afternoon, the battle began. Lithuanian forces under Grand Duke Vytautas launched the first attack against the Teutonic lines. The initial clash was fierce. Cavalry charges thundered across the field as armoured knights collided with Lithuanian riders. The fighting quickly became chaotic. Dust rose from the ground as thousands of men and horses struggled across the battlefield. At one point, the Lithuanian forces appeared to retreat. Some historians believe this retreat may have been a deliberate manoeuvre designed to draw Teutonic knights out of position. Whether planned or accidental, the movement created confusion among the Crusader forces. Many Teutonic units pursued the withdrawing Lithuanians, stretching their lines and weakening their formation. Meanwhile, the Polish army remained firmly engaged with the core of the Teutonic forces. The battle raged for hours. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Knights clashed with swords and lances. Infantry fought hand-to-hand across the field. Eventually, the Lithuanian forces regrouped and returned to the fight. Now the Teutonic army found itself attacked from multiple directions. The turning point came when Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen personally led a charge toward the Polish position. In the chaos of battle, the Grandmaster was killed. The death of their leader dealt a devastating blow to the morale of the Teutonic army. Without clear command, their forces began to falter. The Polish and Lithuanian armies pressed their advantage. One by one, the remaining Teutonic units were surrounded and defeated. By the end of the day, the battlefield was covered with the dead and wounded. Many of the highest-ranking leaders of the Teutonic Order had been killed or captured. The Battle of Grunwald was a decisive victory for the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. The defeat shattered the military prestige of the Teutonic Knights. For generations, the Order had been considered nearly unstoppable. Now its power had been broken in a single catastrophic battle. Yet despite the scale of the victory, the war was not immediately over. The Allied armies advanced toward the Teutonic capital at Marienburg, hoping to deliver a final blow to the Crusader state. But the fortress proved difficult to capture. The remaining forces of the Order managed to defend the castle long enough to prevent a complete collapse. Even so, the balance of power in the Baltic region had changed forever. The Teutonic Order would never again dominate the region as it once had. The defeat at Grunwald marked the beginning of a long decline. For the first time in centuries, the crusading movement in the Baltic was beginning to lose momentum. The age of the Northern Crusades was slowly coming to an end, but the consequences of these wars would continue shaping the region for generations to come. The final chapter of this long conflict was still ahead, not disappear overnight. The Crusader state still possessed powerful fortresses, experienced soldiers, and a network of fortified cities along the Baltic coast. For a time, the war continued. After the battle, the Polish and Lithuanian armies marched toward the Teutonic capital at Marienburg. This enormous fortress was one of the largest castles in Europe and the administrative heart of the Teutonic state. If the Allies could capture it, the power of the Order might collapse entirely. But the defenders of Marienburg managed to organize a desperate resistance. Under the leadership of the Teutonic commander Heinrich von Plauen, the fortress was reinforced and prepared for siege. When the Allied armies arrived, they faced a well-defended stronghold protected by thick walls, towers, and disciplined defenders. The siege dragged on for weeks. Disease and supply shortages began to weaken the attacking armies. Eventually, the Polish-Lithuanian forces withdrew. The Teutonic Order had survived. Yet survival was not the same as victory. The defeat at Grunwald had permanently weakened the Crusader state. In 1411, the war officially ended with the First Peace of Thorn. The treaty forced the Teutonic Order to pay large financial reparations and return some contested territories. Although the territorial changes were relatively small, the economic consequences were severe. The cost of the war and the required payments strained the finances of the Order. Taxes increased across its territories. Merchants and cities that had once supported the Teutonic state began to grow dissatisfied with the leadership of the Order. Over the following decades, internal tensions continued to rise. By the middle of the 15th century, many cities and nobles within the Teutonic state openly rebelled against the authority of the Order. This conflict became known as the 13 Years' War, which lasted from 1454 to 1466. Once again, the Kingdom of Poland fought against the Teutonic Knights. But this time, the Order faced not only foreign enemies, but also rebellion within its own lands. The long war ended with another treaty, the Second Peace of Thorn. This agreement permanently reduced the power of the Teutonic Order. Large parts of its territory became part of the Polish kingdom. The remaining lands continued to exist under the authority of the Order, but now as a vassal state under Polish influence. The Crusader state that had once dominated the Baltic was slowly fading. Yet the legacy of the Northern Crusades did not disappear. Over the centuries, the territories once conquered by the Teutonic Knights continued to evolve. In 1525, the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order in Prussia, Albert of Brandenburg, made a dramatic decision. During the Protestant Reformation, he dissolved the remaining monastic state and converted the territory into the Duchy of Prussia. This new duchy became a secular state and accepted Protestant Christianity. In time, it would come under the rule of the Hohenzollern dynasty, a powerful German family. Over the following centuries, this state would grow stronger and more influential. Eventually, it would transform into the Kingdom of Prussia, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. And in the 19th century, Prussia would lead the unification of Germany. In this way, the legacy of the Northern Crusades continued to shape European history long after the wars themselves had ended. But the consequences were not only political. For many of the indigenous peoples of the Baltic region, the Crusades brought profound cultural change. Some societies were gradually absorbed into new Christian kingdoms. Others disappeared entirely. The old Prussians, whose lands had been conquered by the Teutonic Knights, eventually lost their language and cultural identity. German settlers and Christian institutions transformed the region over generations, yet traces of the older world survived in folklore, place names, and traditions that endured long after the pagan temples had vanished. Today, the Northern Crusades are often overshadowed by the more famous Crusades to the Holy Land. But for the peoples of the Baltic region, these wars were just as significant. They reshaped borders, destroyed ancient cultures, and created new states whose influence would last for centuries. From the forests of Prussia to the fields of Grunwald, the Northern Crusades transformed Northern Europe. They began as wars of conversion, but like many conflicts in history, they were driven by a complex mixture of faith, power, ambition, and survival. In the end, the Crusaders succeeded in their original mission. The last pagan societies of Europe were converted. Christian kingdoms spread across the Baltic world. Yet the legacy of those wars remains written into the history of the region even today. The Northern Crusades may have ended centuries ago, but their impact still echoes across Europe.